Hello everybody, I'm Jeevan Desada. I'm a program manager in Azure Active Directory, and my core focus is integrating different types of SaaS applications with Azure Active Directory. I also help our customers like you to configure and deploy the apps into their organization. Today, our topic is taking your applications to the next level with user and group provisioning. Our agenda is we'll look about what is the Azure Active Directory provisioning means, how the architecture looks like, and what are the different benefits of using user and group provisioning. Then we will move into the demo where we will see the actual application to be added from the gallery and then configuring it for user provisioning. We also run a program for adding different applications into the app gallery where you as a customer can request that, and we'll see about that particular program. And there is new upcoming the standard, which is SCIM, a standard for provisioning, and we will look into that also in details. So when you go into your organization and when you look at different applications which your users are using, you will able to realize that users are using different productivity application into their organization. For an example over here, Workday is an HR application, ServiceNow is a ticketing system, Salesforce is a sales application. So there are a lot of applications which your users are using day in, day out. But in that, users are using different credentials to log in into that particular application. And you can able to realize that they are having different username and passwords for all these particular applications. Most of the time, the user end up using the same or 2 or 3 kinds of password across multiple applications. It's a very difficult journey for users because they have to remember the username and password associated with those particular applications. So in this picture, you can see there are a bunch of types of username and password that Jim Bob is using, but his corporate identity is jim.bob@contoso.com. And you can see his particular credentials for Workday as in jim.bob, whereas for Zoom application is jbob@contoso.com, and so on and so forth. So the password proliferation is huge in the organization, and the solution for that is first enabling single sign-on. When you enable single sign-on for your users, you can do that easily through Microsoft Azure Active Directory. And you can able to connect to different SaaS applications which are generally hosted in the cloud, and they can easily able to do single sign-on with the organization credentials. When I say organization credentials, that means in the previous picture we have seen Jim Bob has jim.bob@contoso.com as his credential. He can able to utilize that credential across all different applications. Azure Active Directory can connect it to different cloud platforms also, where you can able to control the access to these particular platforms, and user can seamlessly able to single sign on. So for an example here, we can connect to Google, Amazon Web Services, or SAP Cloud. Azure Active Directory also does support the on-premise based SaaS applications connection. That means you can enable single sign-on for some applications like Tableau server, Atlassian Jira or Cloud, or those particular applications which generally goes on-premise also. And the classic example is SharePoint. So you can have a SharePoint on-premise infrastructure and can still able to connect it from Azure Active Directory with single sign-on. When you enable single sign-on, you will realize that you can easily able to make a connection from Azure Active Directory, and users have to authenticate at Azure Active Directory. So in this particular picture, on the left-hand side, you can see this is the login page information for a user in Azure Active Directory. When the user type in his particular credentials, he can directly log in into an application like DocuSign. But on the right side of the picture, you can see if the user does not exist, they'll get a weird error where the error might say that the user does not match or the email address is not associated with that organization, and such kind of errors. So it's important that all these particular applications which users are trying to use, they generally have their own user store and a group store. Sometimes they do have different type of roles and authorization mechanism also built into that application. So let's look at the different application and how they actually store the user credential. or the user store. So here in this particular example, it's a ServiceNow, Box, and Smartsheet and Salesforce application, but each application has its own user store, and each application requires a different kind of attribute from the user. So here in ServiceNow, it's asking for name, email, and country, whereas in the Box application, it's asking for department as one more extra attribute rather than with name and email. In Smartsheet, you can able to see it requires a manager as an attribute, whereas in Salesforce requires UPN. Microsoft Azure Active Directory is the master of identity, or you can see one source of truth for your all identities, which has all kind of information for a user. So here in this particular case, you can see its name, email, address, country, UPN manager, all sort of information is available into Azure Active Directory. When you look at the process today, how you are actually provisioning these particular users into different applications, you might see that there are different kind of methods you are using. The first and very common method which we have seen is CSV, where you actually do a CSV upload on a regular basis to different SaaS applications. And that way you can update user information on ongoing basis. Sometimes we have seen the organizations have written some manual scripts which can call those particular APIs and update the user information on a regular basis. You can have your custom automated solution developed for it, or there might be on-premise solution like FIM or MIM, which is doing this particular job for you. Imagine now you have a HR application which is sending the data to your master of identity like Azure Active Directory through SFTP or a secure channel. Generally, the HR applications have much more richer information of a user, like the employee ID, name, email address, cost center, etc. You can have multiple HR applications, or in this particular example, we have taken Workday, but you can have PeopleSoft like from Oracle or SAP SuccessFactors or any other application, which is pushing the data to your on-premise Active Directory or Azure Active Directory, and then you are taking that information to different applications. So this adds more complexity into the picture, because now the source of truth is that HR application which is pushing the data to your on-premise or Azure Active Directory, and then that particular data is going into different SaaS applications. The major challenges in all those particular solutions what we have seen is about productivity. So if you look at all these manual processes, they are very much error prone. They lead to delays in access and don't scale to large in organizations. That means if you have thousands and thousands of users which you are trying to provision, the manual process may take time, may see some error. And then the question comes is the operations part of it. So if you look at the custom solution or an on-prem solution which you have built it, you need to manage that particular environment and maintain that particular environment with the right set of resources in your organization. If these particular resources are not available at some time, then that actually causes a significant delay, and it can cause a bigger outage also. When we talk about security, manual process can always lead to significant delays, and that actually cause a security issue. Let's take an example of user offboarding over here. That means if the user leaves the organization in a day, your CSV upload thing is going to run only one time a day. That might be at the early morning or might be in the night. And that means the user can be offboarded or removed from that particular application only at a particular time. And that can cause a significant delay between the actual offboarding and the removing the access from these particular application. Till that time, user can log into that particular application and can access the data, which they should not be actually doing. When it comes to governance and compliance, there are certain set of organizations. So think about healthcare, finance industry, or the banking industry. They have a lot of governance and compliance which they need to maintain. So if you have manual or varied process for provisioning for each your application, the governance becomes a challenge in that particular case. Capturing the right set of information with the right time is important to maintain the compliance, and that's what you need to do it for each and every application in that case. When we talk about centralizing application management in Azure AD, we have to think holistically. That means enabling single sign-on is just the basic step, but you can able to achieve automatic user provisioning and deprovisioning of users and groups can be easily achievable through Azure Active Directory. We can offer access panel is one of our feature so that the user can able to access all the applications through one portal. You can manage the risk with conditional access policies, and that way you can able to secure your application. There are audit logs and sign-in logs available so that you can maintain your compliance. For governance, Azure Active Directory does offer different kind of features like entitled management, terms of use, and etc. You can able to remotely access your on-premise solutions without doing a VPN. So that means you're not putting a boundary for your organization, and the user can still able to access all these particular applications remotely. And the main thing is everything managing from the cloud. That means you do not have to do a VPN or remotely access certain servers to manage your infrastructure, but you can easily able to do it from the cloud. Let's talk about Azure AD provisioning a little bit in more details about the overview and how this works. Azure Active Directory is basically a cloud provisioning service. That means it's hosted in cloud, it's associated with your Azure Active Directory, and it's a scalable service. We have two concepts over here in Azure Active Directory user provisioning. We call it as inbound user provisioning and outbound user provisioning. Inbound user provisioning means the identities are going to be provisioned into Azure Active Directory from certain HR applications. So here in this example, we have shown Workday is an HR application which is pushing the identity into Azure Active Directory. Whereas outbound user provisioning is Azure Active Directory is the source of truth and is pushing identity from Azure Active Directory to different SaaS applications. Azure Active Directory also support hybrid user provisioning. In hybrid user provisioning mode, your cloud application such as Workday is pushing the identity to your on-premise infrastructure, and then there is a Azure AD Connect, which is actually syncing identities from your on-premise to the cloud. In the cloud provisioning service, Azure Active Directory offers in that you can add business rules while provisioning. That means you can transform your user attributes or values in such a way that the application needs. And this is sometimes very critical when you are modifying your current process of user provisioning to Azure Active Directory user provisioning. The cloud application administrator is the right role for doing the management of applications into Azure Active Directory. So this is a new role which we have added. You do not have to use global administrator role for this. Azure Active Directory also does provide notification email address on failures so that you can able to configure the distribution list over there and then able to get notification from Azure Active Directory for all the failures which are happening on the provisioning side. Azure Active Directory also provides the detailed logs for debugging. So if you're setting up the application and getting errors, then you can go into the details and debug it pretty easily. There is a reporting and governance and compliance available. We have hundreds of SaaS applications where Azure Active Directory does support outbound user provisioning. If your organization is developing some line of business applications and you wanted to leverage user provisioning, then SCIM is another standard which you can able to leverage and easily set up user provisioning from Azure Active Directory. We will talk a little bit in more details about SCIM and how do you configure the application into the demo. You might be thinking about if your application today is in ADFS, why I should move that to Azure Active Directory when my application is working with ADFS and my business processes are already set up for user provisioning. But remember that ADFS is just for single sign-on. It can't do provisioning and deprovisioning to applications. You have to manage your security for ADFS servers, you own your infrastructure. So it's not about just ADFS server, but it's also about managing ADFS proxy servers along with it. The operation management, infrastructure management is to be done by you. So that means you have to employ people to manage that particular infrastructure, and it becomes very costly affair. If you are having Azure Active Directory, then it's a true cloud-based service. We do have a great machine learning capability which offers security. Azure Active Directory receives 2 billion authentication every day, and our machine learning capabilities always understand the new attacks which we are receiving on a daily basis, and we prevent you from that. You can do single sign-on to thousands of applications very easily, and you can able to manage that particular provisioning and single sign-on solution from the cloud. You do not require to maintain infrastructures. Everything is being managed through Azure Active Directory with a single license. So those are some of the benefits why you should be moving from your application from your on-premise ADFS server to Azure Active Directory. And if you have enabled single sign-on already with those particular applications, then we highly recommend that you should be enabling user provisioning with those applications into Azure Active Directory directly. We talked about Azure Active Directory App Gallery, but let's have a look at it and understand what it means. Basically, Azure Active Directory Application Gallery is a common place for our customers so that they can able to access applications from the gallery. Azure Active Directory does support different federation protocols, and so our gallery also supports SAML, WS Federation, OpenID Connect, and OAuth-based application into the application gallery. You can configure automatic user provisioning with these applications once you add these applications into your tenant. So think more about these are the templates which are available for your ready use, which are certified by Microsoft and tested by Microsoft, so that you can just able to add that application into your tenant and configure it for single sign-on and user provisioning. You can do configuration of single sign-on for federated single sign-on, password single sign-on, and link single sign-on, and so on and so forth. Azure Active Directory also does offer the custom application template, or we also call it as non-gallery application template. And this template offers the SAML-based single sign-on and Scheme 2.0 based user provisioning. We will see what the Scheme protocol means and what it means in a little bit later. Note that you will require Azure AD Premium 1 license to use the non-gallery application template. We highly recommend that use this template only for your line of business applications. For all your SaaS applications, you should be using Azure Active Directory App Gallery, where we provide these templates for single sign-on and user provisioning. Let's move to the demo now, and we will see how do you add the application from the gallery and then configure provisioning to authorize access. How do you map the attributes? How do you set the scope of the application? And then once you enable provisioning with it, then you can able to monitor the progress of the provisioning, and then you can review the logs for failures. So we will see all those particular things in the demo. Let's dive into the demo now. The first thing what you should be doing is using Azure Management Portal for managing all your applications. The portal URL for this is portal.azure.com. When you type in this URL, it will ask for credentials. Log in with your global admin credentials or the cloud app administrator role, which we talked about. And then you can able to see Azure Active Directory as one of the managed service in the Azure portal. There are two particular options available related to application in Azure Active Directory: Enterprise Application and App Registration. Note that there is a difference between two. Enterprise application is being made for SaaS applications. That means if you are adding new SaaS applications and configuring them for single sign-on and user provisioning, then you should be actually using Enterprise Application option. App registration option is for developers, where developers can come and register applications so that whatever the application they are developing inside your organization, they can able to use Azure Active Directory authentication for that application using OpenID Connect OAuth as a protocol. According to the protocol, it says you have to register application with the OAuth provider, and that's why the name is app registration. Note that again, this is for your developers, and if you want to manage your applications, which are SaaS applications or consent-based application, then you should be using Enterprise Application. We talked about a role or different RBAC particularly roles available in Azure Active Directory. So let's look at that first. When you click on the users particularly option in Azure Active Directory, it will present all different kind of users you have in your organization. This includes the members and the guest. You can select any of that particular user and then look at the directory role. For managing application, you require a specific particular type of role so that you can able to manage different application, and that you can do it by clicking on Add Assignment button. Add Assignment button shows you the default roles we have in Azure Active Directory. For managing application, you require the Cloud Application Administrator role. So with that, you can create and manage all aspects of app registration and enterprise apps. And for app developer, you have a specific role called application developer where they can come and register application. Note that you don't need to use your global admin credentials to manage the applications now. If you want to manage conditional access policies for the application, then there is a different role for it. Note that the Cloud Application Administrator role, you cannot actually modify or see any of the conditional access policies associated with that particular app. Note that this is the role which you are using, and let's assign this particular role to an user. And with that, now this particular user called Aditya can able to manage all applications in my directory. Now go into the enterprise application where it shows all the list of applications which you have configured in your tenant so that your users can use it. There are different types of SaaS applications available, as you can see, Ignite, Box, Apptio, and so on and so forth. If you want to add a new application, then there is a button called New Application, which will take you to the application gallery. Today we have 3,200 plus applications over here, but note that every day we do add applications into the app gallery. So you can able to easily search for any of the SaaS applications which you want by typing the name of the application over here. Now I'm trying to search for Salesforce application, and it gives me an option of there are two different Salesforce application available into the app gallery. It also shows the different single sign-on modes available, and you can read the documentation for an application by clicking on the link over here. When you click on the link, it will go to the public documentation for configuring single sign-on. If you want to see the provisioning particular article, you can able to see on the left navigation. And with that, if you expand this further, you can able to see all the applications which are available for user provisioning today through Azure Active Directory. Whenever we are publishing new application, we publish the documentation for that application also, so that you can just follow the documentation for an app, and that way you can able to configure the application for provisioning. There is also an option of a search button over here where you can able to search for an application and look for the single sign-on tutorial and the provisioning tutorial. Today we are going to see the demo of Dropbox application. So I'm going to search for a Dropbox application, and once I see this particular application, I can able to rename the application and add the application into my tenant. Once I click on the add button, now the application will get added into my tenant. And now I can configure it for single sign-on and user provisioning. Again, note that single sign-on and user provisioning are two orthogonal features. That means you can enable them in any sequence. You can enable single sign-on first and get that working, or you can enable provisioning first and get that working, or you can do both one after another. There is no specific sequence, but our recommendation is you should be enabling provisioning first, because your users has to be present into your target system. And once your users are there in the target system, then you can enable single sign-on. If you're migrating your applications from your ADFS or any other provider to Azure Active Directory, then you can enable single sign-on first, test the integration first, and then go for provisioning, because at that time, the identities are already present into your target system. And we will also see a scenario where how do you map these particular identities and make sure that your user provisioning is not duplicating the identities, but mapping the right identities into the target system. The first step, what you need to do is assigning users and groups. Here, the Azure Active Directory uses a principle of a minimum set of rights for the application in a security model. That means if you look into the properties, you can able to see that the user assignment is required to yes. That means only the assigned users and groups for this particular application can able to leverage the single sign-on, and only these particular users will get provision into the target system. That is why you should go to users and groups and add different users or groups into the application. In the users and groups, I can able to search. So let's select Aditya and couple of more users along with my existing user, which is Timothy Perkins. I'm selecting that, and I'm going to assign these particular users to my application. I can also select the groups. For testing, we generally suggest that you should start with a smaller group, which is mostly like a test group, or you can select few users for your application so that you can able to test the provisioning. Once the provisioning starts working correctly, and once you validate that everything is correctly been set it up in Azure Active Directory and in that application, then you can expand your scope to more users in your organization. Now let's click on the provisioning and then see how do you enable user provisioning with the app. By default, all the provisioning when you add the application, it's set to manual. Now we are going to enable this for automatic user provisioning with Azure Active Directory. That's why you have to choose the automatic option. The first thing which it will ask for authorization. That means you need to make sure that you log into with admin credentials to that target app and authorize yourself. In this process, Azure Active Directory will prompt for authentication and get the token credentials from that particular app and save into Azure Active Directory. Different applications can have different authorization model. That's why you will see a difference when you add one application versus another. In this particular Dropbox example, I have an authorize button, and after clicking on that particular button, it shows me a page where I have to authenticate with my admin credentials at Dropbox. I'm already logged into Dropbox over here, and that's why you can able to see, I can see my dashboard. So when I click on authorize button over here, it actually shows me a prompt and it just goes away. The reason for that, because there is already an active session with Dropbox application here. Once I have done my authorization, I can able to test my connection to make sure that Azure Active Directory can reach out to this particular application correctly. So I can click on the test button and you can see that it's testing my connection and my connection is successfully been verified. The next thing is setting up notification email, which we talked about a little while ago. Ideally, we suggest that you should be configuring the distribution list over here, not the single person username. And that way, most of these particular people in that particular distribution list will get notification email if there are failures happening. Now I have configured my distribution list over here. I check the box saying that send an email notification when a failure occurs. And I can able to save this configuration. Once I saved my configuration, the next thing will happen is it will enable my mapping. Now you can see it has saved my configuration and my mapping is enabled. There are two types of mapping Azure Active Directory provides. One is the user object mapping, another is a group object mapping. Both these particular mappings are available for different applications. That means in some applications, they just support user-based provisioning and not group-based provisioning. In that particular case, you will only see users as an option. Dropbox application particularly support users and groups, and that's why both these options are shown here. These particular options enable that I can able to manage the scope and different user properties of my user, so that only I can able to push those particular user information into the target system. So let's look into the Azure Active Directory user mapping. Note that by default this has been enabled and set to yes. There is a target object actions. This particular checkbox enable you to do different kind of operations into the target system. By default, create, update and delete, all three actions are selected. That means you can enable creation of an identity into the target system, updation and deletion. I can select only create or update and delete based on my requirement or based on your particular organization, how you want to use the user provisioning connector. I'm going to make it all three available because I really want to create identities, update the identities on ongoing basis and delete the users. Note that delete does not mean that we are going to delete the user into the target system, but it is more about disabling the particular user into the target system. By default, Azure Active Directory has worked with these particular vendors and figured it out what are the different attributes in terms of required attributes and optional attributes the target system requires. Here in Dropbox, username is the field in their user store, which actually does the mapping for identifying the unique user into the Dropbox. I have right now chosen user principal name, but you can able to change this mapping by clicking on this particular row and selecting the right attribute from our drop-down list. The source attribute over here can be anything like extension attribute, directory extensions, or the default attribute. You can also select like mail, for example, which is by default first class attribute from Azure Active Directory, so that you are mapping the user's email address from Azure Active Directory to the username field in Dropbox. This is the customization which Azure Active Directory offers. We call this as direct mapping of the source attribute to the target system or target attribute. You can also achieve the expressions over here, where you can select the expressions and then you can able to write an expression in this particular box, and after that you can do a business transformations of the user attribute over here. Azure Active Directory has provided a detailed documentation how to use expressions into Azure Active Directory user provisioning, and you can able to find that details on our documentation page. That way you can easily able to build your business rules into the Azure Active Directory provisioning connector. Right now I'm going to keep this as direct. Along with that, if you want to add new mappings, there is an option available where you can click on add new mapping and you can able to select the source attribute and the target attribute. Generally, the target attribute list is populated based on the information which that vendor has provided to us. Right now, only ID is another target attribute which is available, which you can map it from your source attribute. And it can be your employee ID, it can be your user object ID. Based on your requirement, you can able to map that. Once you have done this particular mapping, it will get added into these roles. You can see that I can able to delete these two particular attributes because those are optional into that particular target system. When you click on the Show Advanced button, you will able to see that you can request Azure Active Directory so that we can able to add all supported attributes. If you feel that the attribute which you require in the target system is not available today, then please let us know and we can add those particular attributes into this particular connector as you need it. Now let's go into the scoping part of it. Scoping means you're trying to scope your particular user provisioning to only certain set of objects. There are two types of scoping available in Azure Active Directory. And the first scoping is in the user objects, you can click on the source object scope and then define the scope. So just take an example over here. When we add the scoping filter, you can say, I want to only provision users where the user.department equals to IT, for an example. So that means only I want to provision users from the IT department into this target system. and then you can able to add the name for that particular scoping filter, and like this you can able to add multiple scoping filters. But note that when you add multiple scoping filters over here, they will be getting evaluated using AND condition. So as you add multiple conditions, it will form the AND particular expression, and output of that we will evaluate for every user provisioning. In general, if you have only selected few users first to check your particular user provisioning connector, then you don't need to do that. So let's click on the save button and save these particular settings for now. Note that I haven't added any of these particular scoping filters in this particular scope attribute. There is another scoping available, and that will be available when you actually click on the provisioning status on. So I can make this provisioning status on and just click on the save button. Now you can able to see it's been successfully saved and my provisioning service has started. There are two more things which are noted over here called current status and statistics to date. That means Azure Active Directory now can run the provisioning service for Dropbox application, and it will show me the status, and also it shows me the statistics. Let's refresh the page and then we can able to see the progress. Note that our provisioning service, first time when it runs, it actually looks at all users into your particular tenant, all the user objects and the group objects, and then further down it looks into who is in the scope and who is not in the scope. So here you can see there is a scope button which says sync only assign users and groups. This is one of the another scope which we talked about. That means ideally by default this particular option is selected. That means in your target system we are going to sync only the users and group objects which you have assigned to your application. If you are using application like Zscaler or ticketing system like ServiceNow, then you might need an option to say sync all users and groups. With this particular option, Azure Active Directory is going to look into all users and group objects in your tenant and going to sync all of them into the target system. Note that after this particular filter, we will apply the another scoping filter which you have mentioned into the user object or the group object, and after evaluating that, we will provision those user objects into the target system. If you feel that you have done some incorrect mapping, then you can restore the default mapping by clicking on this button. If you feel that I was just testing and it's not going correct, then you can clear the current state and restart the synchronization. We have recently been added this particular progress bar where it shows the current progress of provisioning the identities. You can refresh the button so that it can refresh with the latest status. You can look into the provisioning details over here on the right hand side where it says last completed cycle and how much time it ran. The steady state timing is also been shown, and note that the provisioning interval is at 40 minutes today. There is no way through which you can able to change this provisioning interval today. It's been 40 minutes, but we are working on a smart scheduler where based on your tenant size and other multiple parameters, we can evaluate and we can run this in a flexible mode. If you have any problems into your provisioning connector and if you're raising a support ticket with us, then we might need this particular technical information where it gives you a synchronization job ID and the activity ID. But otherwise, you don't need these particular details. Right now, you can see that it's showing me there are 3 errors occur, and now we will look into the logs. Then how do you debug them? The provisioning logs are available on the left-hand side, and this is still in public preview. So as you have sign-in logs for single sign-on, we do have a provisioning logs now. The provisioning logs shows all the logs information for user provisioning. You can see my target system might be Box, Dropbox, Oracle, or SAP Cloud Platform, or multiple others. So I can filter these particular logs based on the target system. So right now I'm going to type in the name as Dropbox and click on the apply button so that only I can able to see the logs related to Dropbox. There is one more option over here called status, where I can able to see the messages related to success and failures. Let's look at the success message first and then we'll go into the failures. When I click on the success, it shows me the basic 3 or 4 steps over here. The first step is about import. That means we are going to look into a user. This particular user, we looked into Azure Active Directory, we found this user, then we have determined whether this particular user is in scope or not in scope based on your scoping filter what you have set up, and then we are going to provision this particular user into the target system. Note that over here that it seems like user was updated in Dropbox because it seems like we found this particular user into the target system, and based on that we take an action whether we need to update the user or we need to create the user. But this will help you understand the overall process of provisioning by looking at these logs. If there are any errors, then we will also show you the error and the troubleshooting and recommendation from Azure Active Directory side. The modified properties option shows like we have now added ID as in particular value. So you can see this particular user is been updated with ID as a property name, and then there is a value which has been assigned. In the summary, you can able to see that this is a Azure Active Directory user, and this is a Dropbox provisioning connector, and the particular user detail is this particular Aditya as an user with the source ID this, and we provision this user into a target system as Dropbox. Here you can see that the type is SCIM, so Azure Active Directory is using SCIM 2.0 with Dropbox for the connector. Now let's look into the failure part of it. When you are looking into the failures, first thing is you need to look into the steps. And here again, we can see import, determine, and match is working, but the provisioning has failed. So the provisioning is failed to create this particular type of user. We will look into the detail why there is a failure. The troubleshooting and recommendation tab now shows that action is create. That means we couldn't find this particular user and we were trying to create a user with this particular UPN value. But it seems that the call was failing with some exception over here. When you look into the summary tab, it also again shows you the details, whereas the target system is Dropbox and we are using SCIM 2.0 for this particular user. In the creation operation, it failed. So this is how you should look into the logs and review for only few certain particularly users whether they are getting correctly created or updated. When you are doing a migration from your existing provider, or if you are enabling user provisioning for the first time for an application, at that time you have to make sure that you are mapping correct identities with the correct property. Here we have used UPN or user principal name for a user to map the user into the target system. That way our connector can find the user based on that property into the target system and only update the users. If you don't do that, you will end up creating duplicate identities into the target system. That is why the mapping is really important over here. Along with that, once you have enabled provisioning, you can go to the single sign-on and then you can enable different types of single sign-on for that application. Azure Active Directory also recommends coming and configuring conditional access policies for the application. Our recommendation is you should be creating organization-wide policies and mapping that to the application so that you can able to secure your application based on different conditions. This is how you can enable provisioning and enable your user identities and group particular identities provision into the application. If you have like high number of errors, you can able to see that we automatically put you into a quarantine state where because of the high number of errors, we are going to retry it little later. And you can able to refresh the results with it. Thanks for watching that awesome demo. And now let's move back to the our particular provisioning slides. So we do have a lot of provisioning connector recently enabled. When we started this particular year, we had 30 plus connectors only available into the app gallery, which supports user provisioning. But now is the new standard which is coming super fast, and there is a great adoption which we have seen. We have enabled now 90 plus applications for user provisioning. If you have added the application before, something like Zscaler, Atlassian, Snowflake, Salesforce, or Rike, or many other, now you can enable user provisioning with these applications pretty easily. Note that this catalog is growing super fast, and you as a customer also now can request these particular applications to be available into the app gallery and enable it for user provisioning. Once you request that, then we'll make sure that we enable the user provisioning for that application and make it available into the gallery so that you can take the advantage of it. We talked about SCIM little bit in our previous slides, but what does the SCIM means? We will see in details now. Some years before, all these particular application vendors have started creating their own APIs for the user CRUD operation. When I say CRUD, means create, update, and delete operations. All these particular APIs, Microsoft have to study, and then after that, we used to enable user provisioning for that particular application. It used to add a lot of time because we have to make sure that we invoke those APIs, custom APIs for every particular application, and we have to write our code accordingly. And we also have to maintain that particular connector to make sure that it performs with the standard. In 2016, there is a new standard called System for Cross-Domain Identity Management. And basically, this particular standard is being registered under IETF and provides a way for these particular vendors so that they can able to use the standard for user provisioning. It provides a standard operations for user and group identity creation, update, and delete. And with that, there is a standardization happened. We have seen this particular standard is now greatly adopted into the community, and there are a lot of partners and service vendors who are now developing their application with SCIM as a standard for user provisioning. The current version of SCIM is 2.0, but it started with version 1.0 in 2016. Azure AD adopted this particular standard very early in 2016, and that's why Azure AD does support 1.0, SCIM 1.1, and 2.0. If you're developing applications inside your organization, or if you already have a SaaS application which is available for all our customers, then we highly recommend that you should be using SCIM standard for enabling user provisioning and group-based provisioning. If you want to look at the details of the standard, then there is a short link available called aka.ms/SCIM-spec, and with that you can able to see all the details about the standard. It's an open API for managing identities, so please feel free to have a look at it and use this particular standard. Azure Active Directory also does provide the detailed documentation on how to use SCIM and what type of work payload which you have to send to us. Everything has been explained in the article. Azure Active Directory also does support a program where you as a customer can request new applications to be added into the gallery. We call this as Application Integration Program for customers. Here in this particular program, customer requests an app to be added into the gallery, and our Get to Integration team integrate that particular application and delivers it into the app gallery. Here, we work closely with that particular vendor team, providing you as a customer as a visibility of our communication, and then we test this particular integration for single sign-on and user provisioning, and then make it available into the app gallery. Once the application is available into the app gallery, then you can go and add this particular application and take the benefit of it. If you have already added the application for single sign-on, and once we enable user provisioning, the same application which you have already added can be enabled for automatic user provisioning. We have a publicly documented process for requesting these applications under this particular program, which is available using this particular short link called aka.ms Azure AD app request. For this particular request, we use the Microsoft Application Network portal for ISVs and customers to track your applications. And that can be accessed using a short link, aka.ms Azure AD list your app. Here, once you submit your request, you can able to track the progress of the request and make sure that once the application is available, you will get communication on time-to-time basis. If you are an ISV or a partner who has already owns a SaaS application, then you can directly come and submit a request to us. The portal looks like something like this, and we call this as Microsoft Application Network portal, where on the right side of this particular picture, you can see there is app request by customers, a tile. You click on that and you can submit a new request. If you are an independent service vendor or a partner who owns a SaaS application, then you can submit request by ISV particular tile, and then you can answer few of the questions, and then the form will be presented you so that you can submit all your information about SSO and or user provisioning with us so that we can enable it into the app gallery. These are the few of the resources we have. You can look into our detailed documentation for all these particular Azure Active Directory provisioning connectors, which we have made it available. The short link for that is aka.ms provisioning documentation. If you want to look into the new provisioning logs, then use the aka.ms provisioning log documentation. And as I said about the scheme specification, you can look into aka.ms scheme spec. Sign up for more webinars using a link aka.ms/AAD webinars. Thanks for watching this video and being with us. Have a great day.